Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this evening, sponsored by the DC Distributed Health Blockchain Innovation Group. And I'm delighted to introduce this evening's speakers, which I'll do in a moment. Before we get started with that, I just wanted to take care of a couple of quick housekeeping items so that you know all of you are in listen-only mode. It means you don't have to worry about background noise, and we've got clean audio throughout. In terms of what to expect, we're going to have our guest speakers co-delivering a presentation for 10 to 15 minutes after we've asked you, the audience, a couple of key questions about your background in research administration. After that, we're going to go into an interview segment and a discussion-oriented exploration of Science Distributed and their mission and vision and approach to market. And following that, we might ask you one or two additional poll questions and then open it up to the audience for questions. During the content delivery, I highly recommend that you all capture your questions as they're occurring to you in the question and answer dialog box in the GoToWebinar utility. And we will reserve 20 to 30 minutes at the end of the event to take questioners off of mute. It'll sound like a radio show. You'll know before that happens. I'll announce your name and encapsulate your question. You'll have engagement with the speakers. I'll put you back on mute, and we'll move to the next set of questions. So with that, we'd like to start with introductions. Maybe we can begin with you, Dr. Mannion. Would you provide an introduction of yourself?
Certainly. Thank you, Heather. Thank you for having us here. Thank you for the guests out there that I can't see. I appreciate you guys coming by. My name is Sean Mannion. I am a neuroscientist. I was a brain scientist for the Defense Department for a long time. I went to Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, where I studied neuroscience, and I later did a postdoc. Wanting a little bit of a broader vision, I moved on to research administration at the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, where I was Deputy Chief of Staff and then later Research Activities Chief. It was a traumatic brain injury research network that we got to oversee. It was a great experience, but about 6 months ago, I moved on, and now I'm in the realm of entrepreneurial startups. And with that, I've started to incorporate blockchain and what it can do for research into my vision of the future, and partnering with John Roising and others. We are going to be rolling something out in January called Science Distributed, and Heather has provided us with a soft launch here, so we're going to explain a little bit what we're going to do, especially with respect to blockchain, and we hope to entertain, educate, and hear back from you on how we can do it better. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mannion. John?
Hey, everybody. My name's John Roising. I am a serial entrepreneur. I've had several businesses over the years. Most recently, I ran a cocktail bar in Baltimore for the past 10 years, where I started taking Bitcoin as payments in as early as 2011. Because of that, we ended up having Bitcoin monthly meetups, and you only learn a little bit about Bitcoin before you start learning about blockchain and the technology and what makes a Bitcoin valuable in theory. And so that led me down this road of learning about blockchain, thinking about blockchain and what it could do. And then after a couple of talks with Sean for this business he wanted to start up, I said, hey, buddy, we need blockchain if we're going to do this right. So that kind of led us to where we are today. I do a lot of speaking and educating on Blockchain 101, executive awareness, and helping people lay out their projects and the data structure that would be involved into doing a blockchain correctly.
Fantastic. And John, one of my favorite things I ever heard you mention was that you're someone who has sold, $600 beers as a result of the Bitcoin purchases and what's happened with the pricing there. So very, very smart moves on your part. Well, so before we get started with your presentation, audience, and we've still had audience members climbing during these first few minutes. It's only 4 after the hour. We'd like to get a sense of who you are so that Dr. Mannion and John can to a degree target the amount of research fundamentals that they address in their presentation. So we would like to start our first poll The way that this works is I'll see how many by proportion of you have responded to the question. It should have flashed up on your screen. We're asking whether you are involved in medical research professionally or have been involved. We do thank you for your feedback, and let's just give this a few more minutes. We're at 67% of you have voted already, so that's an exciting and engaged audience. Thank you so much. 71, let's get it to 90%. And then what will happen is I will display the results, and all of us that are sharing this evening together will have a sense of how much of a background in research the audience has. All right. Okay, great. We hit our goal. So let me share the results. And here we are. So we have 52% of our audience are not involved in medical research, and we have no basic scientists on the call this evening. 10% clinical researchers, 5% research admin and leadership, and 33% who are involved in a combination of those areas. Any reaction to those poll results, John or Dr. Mannion?
Not surprising from what I've seen before. I think that with the push of blockchain in healthcare, there are more clinical individuals and clinical researchers who are starting to become familiar with what it can do for different types of data outside of the financial system. I think basic research is another area it can do a lot, but I don't think it's really penetrated as to the advocacy and education in that area yet. Very good to know. So we will learn from that.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hide my webcam, advance to the first slide, and I'll jump back on as you complete your this segment.
Outstanding. Thank you, Heather. Once again, thank you all for being here. My name is Sean Mannion. I, along with John, are from Science Distributed, which is a project and company set to launch in January, but Heather has given us an opportunity to give you a little bit of oversight of what we are planning to do. And so kind of like a restaurant, I view it as a soft start. We're not going to focus on the whole package today. This is a blockchain focused group. So I want to stick with what we are doing in relation to blockchain, though Science Distributed is much larger than that. At least half of you are involved in medical research. So I think you probably realize that there are opportunities to do a lot more with the current resources that are available to do medical research. As a person who spent several decades in research and research administration, I got to see a lot of the places we could do things better and ways that could happen. And what I also noticed is there's a lot of funded researchers who may not have the resources that they need to complete projects, either at the front end in developing proposals or at the back end in taking the results and analyzing them and putting them into findings to get them out to the broader community. It was the case that I also know personally and got to read a lot and advocated for finding better ways to engage scientists. There's some very highly trained, highly motivated people who are moved on into other realms and aren't doing much research anymore. One reason is because at this point there's not a lot of academic positions available. I think it's less than 15% of biomedical PhDs go on to an academic or a tenure track position. And so a lot of people's skills are underutilized. And I think people want to utilize those skills, but there's also just a not perfect matching of people with certain skills and people who need those skills. So we were kicking around some ideas of how to make this better. And we came up with the thought that having a platform with a lot of options for people to get together, to do research, to find ways to facilitate that research, facilitate quality control, was something that we wanted to see developed or create. The problem that we saw was scientists don't like to share their data. They're afraid of getting scooped. They're afraid someone's going to mess it up. They're afraid they won't understand it. There was an NIH talk on data storage I saw recently, and I think it was a very pithy quote that scientists would rather share a toothbrush than share their data sometimes. And I think that's a cultural problem, but I think it's based on some real concerns and real issues in the publish or perish environment. Maintaining your IP for published research is something that's very critical to careers. And so I was moving around this problem. I talked with John about it. I didn't buy any of the $600 beers because I didn't spend Bitcoin at the time. But I did go in there and talk with him. He had been at Johns Hopkins, so he understood some of the pain points to research. And then one day he said to me, this is in fall of 2016. He said, Sean, you need blockchain. And it was kind of the Jim Mora, if anyone's familiar with the old Colts coach, going playoffs. I don't know what a blockchain is. So I said, blockchain, what's that? And I went home, and as luck would have it, or not luck, a very motivated individual at Health and Human Services named Debbie Bucci had spearheaded a white paper contest for utilizing blockchain for healthcare and research. And I think in September of last year, those 15 winning papers were published, and I sat down. They had just been put up, and I read through them, and it was amazing. I mean, they covered everything from how blockchain could be applied to billing to how it could be applied to healthcare data. But there were a couple, in particular, one from MIT that really looked at what it could do for research, and it opened my eyes. And so I realized that was one of the problem solvings that we had for what we wanted to do with Science Distributed. We wanted to bring scientists together to do more research, but we couldn't find a way of developing that trust quickly. And what's termed the trust engine in one of the famous historical blockchain papers, I think in The Economist, going back to 2015. It brings trust in a way that, many people worry Bitcoin is used by criminals. Well, if criminals can trust criminals based on this technology, it seems like scientists can trust scientists based on this technology as well. And so with that missing piece, we set out to make this idea of a platform for bringing scientists together and utilizing blockchain for trust into a real thing. And we'll go over the benefits a little bit more later, but I think that one of the benefits to this increased research is doing more with the resources that are out there, bringing the PIs and the available researchers together to do what they love doing, to get better results and quicker results, and to publish and move on in their careers. And for all of society and the funders of this research, you get better science, you get cheaper research, and you get faster miracles. And with that, I think I want to go on to the blockchain piece a little bit. Like I said, there's more to it that we'll have a launch in January, and you'll be hearing more. But for blockchain, it's a little bit counterintuitive for some people, especially if you've only heard of Bitcoin. Well, what are you going to fund research with Bitcoin? What are you doing here? And that's not it. And I think many people in this forum are probably familiar with the technology that underlies it. And that technology is a distributed ledger, a distributed database. And we think that distributed database or distributed ledger, especially in research, definitely in healthcare and stemming from healthcare data, you can do more research. But in research, it can give you this better science, cheaper research, and faster miracles. The better science comes from the reproducibility. People who are familiar with science know that there are some challenges, and they've been coming more and more in the spotlight in recent years as they've had to roll back some seminal findings because they weren't reproducible. And that comes from a lot of reasons. But if you've got an auditable trail of all data, if you've got a record of that data, it is the case that you've got an increased level of quality. I think that you can get better science as well because of the standardization that you get when you set up a blockchain. It is the case that there's a lot of data out there that is messy and not mergeable, even across very similar studies, because it hasn't been standardized. I was involved for a long time at Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center with some efforts to standardize data in traumatic brain injury. And there's one called the Federally Integrated Traumatic Brain Injury Registry, which is co-hosted by the NIH and the DoD and VA, looking to make data mergeable for TBI research. And I think that's, though it's in a centralized format right now, is a step in the right direction. I think that the government agencies want to see this data in a mergeable format, and it's the case that we're going to see a move towards it in future years, especially from the government-funded research. The cheaper research comes from increasing your return on investment. There was a Financial Times article just recently about pharma research just sliding in its return on investment because it's not giving as much bang for the buck as it used to. And I looked at a lot of return on investment of research while I was at DVBIC, Defense of Veterans Brain Injury Center, and there's definitely not what you used to get. And this again comes from a lot of different reasons. But if you can get more from your research dollar, everybody's happy. You know, the researchers are happy, the funding agencies are happy, and society's happy because we can do more with the same amount of resources or less. I think that the reduced data management costs when you bring in blockchain, you bring in smart contracts, and that can even be amplified with AI. But that's another discussion entirely. That's going to give you a huge savings on top of that increased return on investment from more people being able to do research on the same data collection. And finally, you bring in faster miracles. You know, moving from bench to bedside, you know, it's traditionally thought it takes 17 years to get to something that's going to impact outcomes in any disease model. And quite frankly, that's too long. From a researcher's perspective, from a clinician's perspective, from a healthcare agency perspective, from a government perspective, from a society perspective, and even from a personal perspective, we want to see people who are sick, people who are not doing well, do better faster with what we're trying to do. That's why we put so much money into research. And I think that blockchain can speed this up in a number of different ways. You know, from the basic administrative, there's a lot of files, there's a lot of delays when it comes to regulatory IRBs. This can be streamlined. And I've talked to some people recently in the regulatory field, in the privacy field, helping them understand not so much what blockchain can do, changing people's personal health records, but with their own problems and their own files. If we can streamline that process for them, they begin to understand blockchain and they begin to realize faster returns on making sure everybody's privacy is kept appropriately safe in research. And so I think at the base level, that type of speeding up, but definitely allowing more people permissioned access to data. If everyone's IP is protected, if everyone's contribution is going to be recognized because of the immutable record on blockchain, you're going to be able to share that data faster without the same concerns that are there now. And I think there's some cultural changes that need to happen, but I think we've seen that in a lot of different ways. And so we will definitely move towards that. How quickly depends on, you know, how successful we are, how successful our partnerships with other people who are doing this in government or private industry, and how successful overall as a society we are in saying we need to be able to do more with the funding of research that we have. This is a look at networks for research. I think this is a broad brush. Obviously, there's a lot of variation, but I've worked within different types of research forums or places, and research can vary depending upon the mission, the funding, and what type of structure you're in. A centralized structure you're going to see more often in a private company or internal to some federal agencies. Definitely within the DoD, there was very specific research that was done in a hierarchical fashion. Not that there wasn't flexibility in some of the freedoms that the researchers had, but they did not have the flexibility to reach out and just partner with anyone that they wanted. In a university setting, you get a lot more flexibility, but it's still somewhat of a decentralized model. You get little peaks of hierarchy that occur, and some of those are more fluid to match up and meet with others. But there's a culture of working with those who you know well, training up those people below you, and it gets back to that trust. And if we can find ways of engendering trust in a much more distributed fashion, I think we can move to the third, distributed type of network. And the challenge with this is it takes a lot of time to set up. You can't snap your fingers and force everybody into a distributed network. You need to develop it and have them work to develop it themselves to make sure everyone is comfortable with it. And with that, I think that's how we want to approach this. With blockchain, you frequently are starting to see applications to other places beyond finance. More often than not, what I'm seeing, even in healthcare, even in those people starting to touch upon research, is they're putting the build of the blockchain first and then trying to find the network for it. And I think that's a little bit backwards. And the last slide will show sort of how we envision this working. And I've labeled it pilot, but it's more the general approach. But we are starting to put together people for a pilot. We want to be able to build a network of people, and that can be relatively small. We have a few dozen interested parties right now. We're engaging some organizations and some universities. It could be a few hundred people. Beyond that, you're going to have to scale up. But we want to get that network, and we want to build that network first, find that community of interest, and get the feedback from them on what you need in a blockchain, what you don't need in a blockchain, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense for them, from everything from their cybersecurity concerns at the university organizations to their personal concerns of how long it would take before some other person had permission access to their data. And by building that network first, we put the people who want to be involved into it first. I think that after that, you move into the design. This is not financial data. This is not a unit or a part of a unit. Those are very simple data sets. No matter how complex the network becomes, when you're talking about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, it's a fairly straightforward data set that gets moved around. When it comes to healthcare data, when it comes to research data, anyone who's worked with it knows that's not the case. It's very unstructured in some instances. It's very non-standardized. It takes a lot of work to get that set up right, and that design, getting people together, making sure they're on the same page from an idea perspective, I think is the next step. And John not only is a co-founder with me, but he and Lauren Long, another co-founder, have their own sort of boutique blockchain architectural design firm. And what we've found is a lot of different organizations looking to do an implementation of blockchain for their own particular problem. They need to work around what it can do first, and then you need to engage with them. We call it a chain event, to figure out how their data flows, and then you have to work together to figure out what that blockchain architecture will even look like. And I'll let John talk in a moment a little more about that. And then finally, you build it, and that's that. John's much better at that than I'm not a programmer. I understand this enough to drive it. I understand enough to figure out where we want to go on the road, but it takes people with a lot more deep knowledge to figure out what details will then have to be programmed into it, and then the testing and evaluation as you normally have. That's sort of an overview of what we want to do. I realize some of it's vague because we haven't launched yet, but I do want to stress that we're putting together a blockchain pilot. If you do research and you want to be involved in that, contact me, and we would love to include you. You'll see in the second bullet point, we have a question mark by token. We are not rolling out an ICO at this point. We are considering whether to tokenize, whether there would be a value in tokenizing, but we want the network to talk about that. We want them to weigh the pros and cons of that, and we want it to be more about the science, not about trying to rush and make money. If we can build something of economic value, then maybe it becomes that. But right now, we're not really stressing that. And John, besides everything else Heather mentioned, John does some day trading and knows the cryptocurrency market very well, both in the big things like Bitcoin, but also the smaller ICOs. And he sees some stumbling that people have done in trying to roll things out that really don't make sense. And with that, I'm gonna let him talk for a little bit about that point and some other things, just to sort of give you an overview of what we're thinking about with that. Thank you all. John?
Hey everybody. So as Sean was saying, a lot of the businesses that we've been reading about, other people maybe in healthcare, maybe in some other space of the blockchain world, it seems almost like their company is a token company, and then they picked a niche that's not being touched yet. But really, step one was build this token and sell just a whole ton of them, make millions of dollars, and then figure out a way to whatever niche we picked, make that token somehow become a circular economy so that it comes back. Some people have some great ideas and they have a fully functioning circular economy and they're working, and those ones are becoming more and more valuable. And a lot of people have built something where hopefully we sell it, and then maybe one day there'll be a reason for you to use it, or maybe it'll be stored value. But I think we already have coins that are doing that. And there doesn't need to be 300 of them. So, a lot of people ask us as one of our first questions when they start hearing about this idea, are we going to do an ICO? Is there going to be a token? And instinctively, I just want to say no. We're building this network, we're building this business, and then down the road, if it makes sense to finance either growing it or monetize part of getting people involved, then we're not, we're open to the idea, but we're not building a coin company. We're building a company to exchange ideas and information and start this conversation. And it just so happens that blockchain is a great solution for it instead of any of the other available computer technologies out there.
I am turning my webcam back on. Thank you, gentlemen. It's such an inspiring vision. This idea of faster miracles is just an extraordinary body of potential. And it's so exciting seeing a new organization really taking aim at the foundations that set the pace and the cadence of scientific discovery and advancement through translational research into mainstream medicine. I've been focused more on the latter part of that process and later stage clinical research through translation, and also looking at guidelines implementation and comparative effectiveness and those types of things. It's been an interesting set of dialogue looking at that complete continuum and how bottlenecks everywhere in that process result in this slow pace that has become accepted. Everyone believes that this is the pace of change, and it's reached its threshold. A key question that I have that I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this is when you're looking at that first start of the first sections of that research cycle. Where do you think you can get the earliest bang for the buck in terms of science distributed's focus using blockchain and having an early impact on one of those pacing considerations? Dr. Mannion, what do you think?
I think that really part of the early phase is in education and advocacy. I've spent much of the past year talking to people, mostly in government agencies, because that's what I was embedded in and very familiar with and have contacts with. But also we're starting to talk to more people in university settings. There's not a lot of people who know or understand how this applies to what they do yet. And so I think that education is one of the key first things. And in doing so, one of the best ways to educate is to show people its use and its value. And I brought up earlier the example of bringing simple use cases to regulatory individuals or to administration individuals at a university. We're having conversations with a couple of faculty members at a particular university, and the thought is the initial pilot blockchain that we want to try and do with them doesn't have anything to do with research data. It has to do with credentialing or the academic records, or helping their administration do something cheaper and faster with blockchain, and thereby sell them on the value of it. So I think early on, it's going to be some proof of concept for administrators. And if you're able to do that, you're able to show its value, show its safety. I mean, you're going to have to engage the, especially in the federal government, the acquisition offices, the cybersecurity offices. They're going to check it to make sure it's okay. And then once you move past that, you still have some hurdles in making sure the human research protections regulators or the health regulators are okay with it. But all of that can be done by showing them proof of concept that doesn't even touch research data or doesn't even touch health data. So I think that's probably one of the early first steps, not very sexy sounding, but really very effective. You give somebody a way to save money and make their life easier, all of a sudden they're going to listen to you and they're going to see the value in applying this technology. John, any other thoughts on that?
I mean, you're talking about, later this year stuff. Imagine the world where people aren't scared of the word blockchain anymore. Maybe in, 6 months next year, what we could start doing, that there are people reproducing the same work just at different universities instead of enrolling 100 like healthy patients to just get baseline data. What if we already had that on the blockchain and you could just share it with another university? You've just saved yourself the cost, the staffing. I mean, that data is being collected, it's out there, but we're not trusting other people with it. It's all staying in your world. It's not, and there would be no risk to sharing that data if it was just healthy standards to, run a test against.
So I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, there's an opportunity to have very far-reaching, broad-based statistical controls that could be used in research constructs by patient self-sovereign data sharing, as well as research institutions making that kind of thing possible. what comes to mind for me with that is the role of the IRB, or the Investigational or Institutional Review Board, and the way that a protocol needs to be approved with a very specific data management, data capture, data management, data sharing, data use, and all of the associated permissions. I'm really interested in what academic and third-party independent IRBs are thinking about all of this, and the role that they would play in enabling the kind of vision that you just described, Sean and John. Thoughts about IRBs in all of this, and how do you see science distributed partnering with IRBs and working with IRBs in these early days, especially?
That's a great question, because unfortunately it's the case I haven't seen a lot of open dialogue. It might be happening behind the scenes about this subject within that community. I think they're starting to get curious and starting to get interested. I talked to someone who's in such a role in a federal agency recently, and she was very interested in it, and they were starting to figure out what it could do for them and what they need to be concerned about from their privacy or their human research protections perspective. I have learned a bit from Susan Ramanat of Spiritus Partners. Is they're a company that's partnered in the UK and in Scotland with the National Health Service and the University of Edinburgh to roll out a great medical device and adverse event pilot with using blockchain across hospitals in Scotland. She shared with me some of the work that they did for a couple of years to engage the regulators, and I've used that as a sort of lessons learned, how it can happen here. To her knowledge, to the knowledge of others I've talked to, it's a very nascent conversation in the United States. I think at this point I would like to see a broader dialogue to prompt this. We've been working with a human research protections administrator who's advising us, and we've been able to start to write. We're gonna submit hopefully to Blockchain in Healthcare Today, which I'm on the editorial review board, and will have its first issue in January as the first blockchain in healthcare peer-reviewed journal. We want to submit and hopefully publish, if it's reviewed, a regulatory paper that looks at what this can do for regulatory, what are the concerns about it, what are the advantages of it, and outline a roadmap of what could be done to engage the regulators in this country beyond what is already happening. But it's a very nascent conversation. I don't know of a forum where it's being discussed a lot, and it will take time. I don't think anyone's going to greenlight a blockchain enterprise-wide project using people's healthcare data in the U.S. in the next year or two. I think research is a better route in, because you can have a very contained data set, a very contained set of patients, and you can get those patients to understand what they're agreeing to and allow for the consent to use their data in a different way. But I think engaging the regulators, helping them utilize it to make their own lives easier as you educate, and then helping them to understand what it can do to protect the privacy of healthcare data as we do more with it. I think that's the way to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. John, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, when I spent time working at Johns Hopkins, one of the studies we worked on was it was an implanted insulin pump study. And I remember specifically the headaches we had with the IRB, where every time there was the slightest change in the protocol, not only did each one of those patients have to be reconsented, of course, but also we had binders upon binders of this version of the consent form and that version of the consent form, and then we get audited, and this one's out of place and that one's out of place, because it was binders full of paper, which is, of course, that was the way it had to be done once upon a time, but we have a much better option right in front of us right now. So just from the paperwork standpoint, once we get in and start being able to have these conversations with the IRBs and letting them understand what it is and what we're talking about, I mean, really, time, money, headaches. No one's trying to fake anything or pull anything over anyone's eyes, but sometimes you just drop the binder and all those papers get mixed up, and now it's 3 hours worth of work to shuffle them back together. So I can see like a very easy conversation where everybody in the room goes, I get it. Yep, this makes sense. At least I hope so.
Yeah, I can commiserate. In my ancient history, I have experience with research administration on paper, and then have built and utilized clinical trials management systems. And one of the things that's really interesting is how these systems tend to be conceptualized totally in isolation. One of the big cost drivers of research is all the IT infrastructure is generally stood up almost on a protocol specific basis, one protocol at a time, one data set at a time. And there's this enormous recreation of a nearly identical wheel over and over again. And that's just looking at, standard client server centralized kind of basic research admin platforms. It makes me think about whether you have identified a set of patterns within which different protocols would fit. And you could have, you mentioned a roadmap, Dr. Mannion, but you could have maybe a half a dozen different profiles. For example, it's retrospective or it's prospective. It's purely observational, or it has multiple cohorts or arms. It involves statistical controls, or we have, things like that look at patterning that would map to different kinds of utilization of distributed ledger technology. I'm thinking about giving all IRBs in the world a standard set of ways to interpret the privacy and security and ethical considerations using blockchain in research. Have you guys thought along those lines, sort of applying some set of patterns that could potentially be adopted by IRBs around the world?
I don't think we've ever worded it quite as well as you just did. But whenever we're talking to a new customer or a new partner about, we need to better understand your data flow and just the data you're trying to get and the answers you're hoping the data is going to show you, that was kind of what we're chasing at. But I mean, the way you worded that was great. I'm going to record that later and write it down.
I aim to please. That's great. What do you think, Dr. Mannion?
I agree with John. You kind of put two things that we've been talking about together in a unique way. The regulatory we've been looking at, and I guess from a financial and acquisition, we've been looking at the data flow as John described. But it would be great for the regulators to see that breakdown as well. I had the experience at Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, where we had a portfolio of dozens of studies. There was generally 60 plus studies at any given time, and they differ considerably. Some were under $50,000 retrospective by one person who had some time on their hands and a good question. Others were multi-million-dollar 15-year longitudinal study. These can't be treated from an acquisition or from even a leadership review perspective in the same way. And I think what you just brought up is that you can't do it for regulatory either. So maybe, the first paper we're putting together is the exciting world of regulatory. The second one we were planning to put together is the exciting world of cost savings of blockchain applied to data management. You can see we really kind of, try and keep everyone on the edge of their seat. But it seems like now maybe you can help us write a merge of those two as well.
Sounds interesting, and they're definitely going to be absolute scorchers, no doubt. I mean, people are going to be just, yeah. It's So you mentioned longitudinal data, and one of the things that comes to mind, or that I continue to be excited about the use of distributed ledger technologies, I think of it as the first intrinsically longitudinal data structure. Whereas if you've been involved in IT and data management and data mining, being able to create longitudinal views of data is an enormous and complex task with uncertainty involved and imperfect results. And it's not intuitive to people who don't come from that world. So what do you mean? You got a date timestamp on every record. What's the problem? But the devil's in the details there, right? And for the first time, we have a data structure that is always intrinsically longitudinal. And just thinking about what that will open up in terms of study designs that are highly valuable and potentially quite a bit less expensive to achieve in their execution. Thoughts on the implications of intrinsically longitudinal data from a research perspective? Maybe that's kind of a geeky data question. I point that one at you first, John.
I mean, I think, again, I have a couple points that I keep hitting, and it's true. I mean, that data is going to be there and it's going to be searchable, but it's all going to depend on how we set it up initially. Like, how are we capturing it? What does that data look like? And I mean, it'll be stored, sure, and you'll be able to get to it, but are you really going to be able to answer any good questions? And so it depends. I mean, having a good idea of what the data looks like and what questions you hope to answer is always going to be our step one, because a lot of the projects I've read or people have asked me for advice on, and I say, okay, so it's supposed to get you to this answer, but the data you're telling me you're collecting is going in a completely different direction. So I just don't understand if you're going to blame blockchain technology in 6 months when you can't answer this, or you're going to blame your initial design and architecture. So I think it's amazing that we're going to have these long-term records and be able to dig back through it. Like, there's going to be some cool questions that we didn't even know we could answer. But there's going to have to be some very smart people that figure out ways to tease out new answers from this data set that was designed to do something different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dr. Mannion, were you about to say something?
I think John kind of led in there that, you know, getting the data standardized, getting what you want to build into the blockchain first up front is absolutely critical. And again, I think researchers don't yet know about blockchain and what it can do, but I think they inherently understand this, because anytime you've had to develop a research protocol, it requires you to answer a whole lot of questions about what you're going to be doing in future years with data, with everything along the way and every step along the way. And so I think blockchain, it lends itself well to that practice in research. I think with longitudinal data, I definitely see value in this, making the fluidity across multiple, I'm going to call it generations of researchers in longitudinal studies, a lot easier. There's definitely challenges that I've seen, you know, as an administrator with longitudinal studies. When studies, multi-site studies that go on for decades or more, you have staff overturn, you have a lot of things that get lost in the individual knowledge bases that leave, whereas with the blockchain, a lot more than what goes in a research protocol becomes locked in, and so people understand what is happening and what needs to go in and how to standardize that data throughout the lifetime of the study. It makes for cleaner data, it makes for better data sets. I've had the unfortunate nature to, or the unfortunate experience to try and clean up data that had drifted from a multi-site study, where the local IRBs all wanted something a little different as the IRB turned over the course of a decade or more. And the next thing you know, you've got study data coming in from a dozen different sites that have to be blocked into 5 different categories and can't be merged anymore because there was turnover at the local IRB and no one was able to capture at the local staff level that the small changes being insisted upon by the IRB were altering the mergeability of the data. Blockchain saves you from that type of faux pas, error, waste of millions of taxpayer dollars. I unfortunately have seen that happen. It will happen again. It's the nature of the beast when you do multi-site studies, and blockchain helps to clean a lot of that up. And that's why I see a huge amount of value in it.
And if you included in your network large scale, now not to use a faux pas word, centralized IRBs that did multi-site coordination as part of your initial network, a lot of advantages might be gained with that. So I'm thinking about all of the major actors involved in this cycle of research. So we were talking about the potential characteristics that could define a particular protocol. And maybe there are patterns to identify that could map to guidance about how to oversee or what kind of governance model to put in place. Let's take it up kind of at a meta level above an individual protocol and think about investigator recruitment, which I know is something that you've spent a lot of time talking about. Potentially some interdisciplinary convergence that becomes possible in a broad network that Science Distributed might coordinate. The IRB process we've touched on a little bit, but they're an important stakeholder. Certainly peer reviewers is another player in there. And we can't forget our sponsors of research, primarily the government sponsors or corporate sponsors and their needs and objectives. And lastly, our participants, the research subjects. And on the clinical side, all of our basic folks don't have much way to query the rats and other animals that they work on. But so you've got this whole constellation of actors, and some of them I could see a token strategy applying to, for example, maybe to incentivize participant recruitment or protocol adherence over time, or some elements like that. And from a sponsorship perspective, you've kind of got a different perspective from corporate sponsors of research versus government sponsors of research. Maybe we could pause a little bit there on how Science Distributed would address the unique needs and priorities of those large-scale actors that fund most research. There's also NGOs that play a role, but could you maybe speak a little bit to the way that public sector sponsors of research might interact with Science Distributed and its network, and then maybe value add to corporate sponsors of research, maybe pharmaceutical companies, med device, med tech, and so on. How do you see your company relating to those stakeholder groups? That one's for you, Dr. Mannion, to start.
Nope. I had muted myself. Apologize. I think it works over a lot of years. I mean, it's not a simple question, and it's not a simple solution. Blockchain doesn't pull all these things together and streamline a magic future where people are getting paid for their research data and everyone's exchanging some special token and spending at the store and everyone's happy and doesn't need a job as long as they're involved in research. I've seen that future in about a dozen different white papers that have been sent my way. It's not that easy, but there are possibilities down the line, arcing forward. I think there was a rather lengthy and expensive Frost and Sullivan look at blockchain and healthcare that looked at 2025 as sort of the convergence time for a lot of enterprise-wide activity. I've kind of in my own speculation back in January said science will be blockchain by 2025 because I see the progression of things moving that way, but it will take a lot of work, especially the regulatory work. As for Science Distributed, I think our focus initially is going to be primarily on the university settings because it's a very it's a flexible standardized system. Most university research systems are going to function the same way, so if you're trying to bring people together, it's much better to work with that somewhat homogenous group. And so I think we're going to be a platform that really does serve those customers initially, both at the individual researcher level and also at the university level. I think that though needs to happen with dialogue with other types of organizations. Obviously, the funding for most university research comes from the government, so you want to have that key stakeholder involved in the discussion. Similarly, most of it is leading to, as you mentioned, your own company goes into the translation and some of the actual practice in a clinical setting. And so you need to have the dialogue inclusive of those who are in that clinical setting, who aren't doing research or who might be administrating over a hospital. Similarly, the private companies, medical device, pharma, these are individuals and stakeholders you want to have engaged in the conversation, particularly when it comes down to standards. And I think there's groups, whether it be the Hyperledger Project, which is the blockchain arm of the Linux Foundation. There's a group in Nashville called Hashed Health that is bringing together people in healthcare settings to talk about standards in a very forward-thinking way. I think that same dialogue needs to be happening. A lot more open sharing of what you're doing and why. No proprietary, we've got a special blockchain no one's allowed to see. I don't think someone who's got a special blockchain no one can see is going to get used by a lot of people. I think people are only comfortable with this type of technology if they're talking about it. And there's a lot of great intermediary opportunities to bring these things together later, but I think dialogue now to make sure we're all using the same gauge train track rather than some separate gauge that makes travel along them very limited. I think that's the best. But initially, I think it's really for us just the university settings with those funding partners that probably are government, but maybe private industry as the key stakeholders with that open dialogue. John, do you have any other thoughts on that aspect?
Well, I mean, we understand this is a pretty blockchain savvy crowd watching. So hopefully they already understand, just because of the way blockchains function, I mean, the permissions that we can build in, if you are the sponsor and you want to get real-time access to what the data looks like currently, like we want to see it now at 3 months, we don't want to have to wait for the year-end report. Those permission levels would allow them to look at this blockchain and see what's going on, and only be able to have access to the things that the IRB has said, like, it's cool, you guys can look at that, you know, and then everything else stays encrypted on the blockchain. So like, just because of how a blockchain functions, like this is going to give those sponsors better access to the data they're paying for. And that should hopefully make them feel more comfortable about funding more projects.
Amen to that. Amen
Yeah.
to that. Do you all see Science Distributed rolling out, let's call it an aggregation tier of clinical trials data that resides off-chain, but also outside the networks or firewalls of investigating institutions, sites? What does that middle tier look like in your vision architecturally for off-chain data? Do you see direct connections straight through the firewalls of the research institutions, or do you see elevating or abstracting data up out of that into perhaps your own science distributed cloud that is off chain? Thoughts on that? How do you see that coming together? And John,
I think.
Oh, sorry. Or you, Dr. Mannion.
John, you go first. Yours will be a more technically accurate. I'll start talking about clouds and raining data, and it'll just get that's good talk.
Nice, that's good.
I'm envisioning, especially in the beginning here, we're probably going to have to store any of that off-chain data. It's going to have to stay in that walled garden of that university. I mean, we're already asking them to trust this new technology of blockchain, and then we're going to say, and also we're taking all the rest of your data and we're going to store it in our own cloud-based servers. So like, you guys have no access to anything anymore if we disappear. You know, you can only ask so much for a new technology. So I'd envision, if we're going to have that fight and like, trust us on this one thing, that ask is going to be blockchain. And then down the road, maybe we can go to a better model where this data is easier to share and it's not just contained on your local servers at your university or your hospital. But again, these conversations we're going to start having, we're already doing this big ask of blockchain. So I think you can only get away with so much, especially as a new company. There's only we have to build our trust first.
Gotcha. Dr. Mannion, I'm sorry I cut you off before.
That's quite all right. I think, and I mentioned earlier, FITBR, the Federally Integrated TBI Research Registry. That for me is a very nice preliminary model for what you would need to do to blockchain aggregate data across multiple studies. It was really, Colonel Dallas Hack, who along with some others envisioned that. I think they were ahead of their time. It took a long time. It took almost 7 years to get the several dozen common data elements that they have standardized, agreed upon across a community, and then have those standards be put into NIH and DoD and VA funding protocol or funding calls, saying that if you wanted to get these funds, you needed to put your data in this format. Now, I think that's from a government perspective what they want to be able to do. They want more bang for their buck out of the research data. So I think you're definitely going to see an aggregation of data in the future, regardless of what blockchain does and regardless of what Science Distributed does. What we want to do, and I think John's very right, but we don't want to have this data ourselves. We want to be able to facilitate the creation of blockchain that works off of the university or the researcher's own systems that allows for them to share data in a better way. Now, obviously, if the funding agencies are starting to look towards aggregating data, then sooner rather than later, we want to talk to them about how to make that look if you start to integrate blockchain. And I think it does a lot of good things. Similar to what FITBR and a centralized database for aggregation does, but in a much more flexible way. You can have a lot more people have permissioned access to that data. You can get the research done a lot faster with a lot higher quality data because of the standardization of inputs. not at the level of inputting it into a centralized database, but at the input at the site itself where it's collected. And I think that's the advantage of blockchain. By bringing science distributed to matching people together to do this research, or even matching your own group together with a blockchain, we allow people to bring that quality of data together, bring that permission shareability together, and also with the piece I didn't go into with science distributed too much in the platform, have a better connectivity across the research community. Right now, you might have 5 people who are specialized in a certain TBI data set who can get in and work with you on that data. If we set up this platform beyond the blockchain for people to be able to find other researchers, you may have your choice of 50 or 500. The blockchain helps you trust those people quicker.
And I absolutely love that vision, and can't help but recognize that it could create the ability of sort of spontaneously organizing networks of very specialized investigators in a way that breaks down the way that organizational boundaries typically define studies today. Which is not to say that the role of the universities is not absolutely critical in all the infrastructure that they provide, but you could end up with sort of spontaneously generating much broader collaborations in that way. Do you see that? Do you see a future where science distributed enables more of a grassroots groundswell approach? Of investigators, by investigators, for investigators, if that makes sense, that can utilize and support the mission of the institutions that carry their academic affiliation, but allow more rapid freedom of thought and action and expression for scientists that become part of the science distributed network. Is that some of the values or the vision that you're seeing?
I think, and that's sort of an adaptive development in the administrative aspect beyond an adaptive design in a protocol. I think that can happen. I'm not saying we're planning for it to happen, but we're allowing for it to happen within this environment. We want the environment to be developed and created by the network itself. We want to give them the platform. We want to give them the structure for the data sharing via blockchain. But the idea you kind of touched upon of administratively adaptive groups coming together in new and different ways, whether it's to overcome acquisition challenges for government or for university, or whether it's to get the appropriate regulatory reviews, but in new and different structures, and maybe get the IRBs or get the regulatory bodies working together in a different way. I think all of that is possible. I like the idea of bringing adaptivity beyond adaptive design trials, which allow you for adapting your protocol along the way based on certain criteria you set out in the beginning. I think allowing for adaptivity within the overall structure of science as it is now, while still achieving the same goals of regulatory appropriateness, of the appropriate levels of privacy of data, and doing that in a new and innovative way would be a secondary benefit from the platform we're creating. I don't know how to design that. I don't think you design it and have it be successful, but I could see it growing from what we're setting up.
Coming to life organically, which flirts with the AI mentioned earlier in the dialogue. I would love, before we start thinking about opening up to the audience for questions, I just would love to hear some of your ideas. Maybe let's put it out 5 years-ish, about ways that you could see a convergence between AI and distributed ledger technology, maybe some other interesting things like genomics, for example, neural nets, those kinds of things. Can we spend just a few moments just unleashing your inner futurist and expressing some of these brilliant ideas that I know you have been thinking about in the long range? And which of you would like to go first on that one? All right, John, you're up.
Sure. I've been taught, actually, AI comes up a lot in these blockchain conversations. And I think a big part of the reason it does is a well-designed blockchain is going to have this clean data this real useful data that's just delicious to an AI trying to learn and navigate the world. I'm working on a project with a friend, and we're building a deep learning network to try to the 12-word passwords you have to recover your wallet in cryptocurrency. Right now, people tend to write them down and stick them on a sticky note next to their computer, which doesn't really help you if your house burns down and now you don't have a sticky note or a computer. So we're trying to teach this deep learning project to write an email that hides those 12 words in it, and then it can just sit in your Gmail and just be there, right? So
nice.
Right now we're having a problem because the dictionaries we're using to try to teach this program to write emails, everything's all over the place. Like, are we using business emails? Are we using, high schoolers talking to each other about whatever movie they just saw? It's everywhere, and it's everything, and it's chaos. And so we're really fighting with it to try to get it to do what we want it to do. And one of the things we were talking about was the cleanness of the data, and if only we had a better way to get emails just in a standard format. And because of that conversation, I started teaching him about blockchain, and now we went down the AI blockchain rabbit hole and around and around and around. I mean, the cool thing about any blockchain data is it's going to be great. There's going to be a lot of tie-ins, hopefully. I mean, I see most AI projects coming along. They're going to have some sort of blockchain tie-in just because of the way it's going to want to eat the data. As far as what that could be in the next 5 years, the sky's the limit. I mean, all over the place. You could spend another whole hour just coming up with cool ideas.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. I love the eating of data metaphor, the biological feel of that. It so gets to the heart of it. Dr. Mannion?
Delicious data.
Yeah.
I'll reiterate what John said, that there's a limitless future, and you see it a lot in people who are talking about the data and from a blockchain being very amenable to the eating by AI or to the consumption by AI. One of the things that I'll add is that I mentioned with Fitber, getting the data standardized, getting the common data elements created, getting unstructured data into a format that it can be standardized was a 7+ year process. I think that current very close future state AI may be able to bring that process down a little bit. So I think as you're looking to get data into that format that it can be consumed by AI, you can utilize AI to save you some of the work. I mean, you still want to have some humans on the back end, but you might be able to shrink that time for standardization down considerably. And I think that's critical for some of the the multiple data sets and the large unstructured data in healthcare and in research. If it took 7 years for one disease state and traumatic brain injury, the same type of challenge is going to be there for every single data set that's out there. And some are going to be a little more simplistic. Some, like psychological health, will be even more difficult. So layering the AI early in that process, one, saves you many years in the standardization, and two, probably primes it to be consumed or eaten on the back end by that same or similar design AI. So it's both cook and consumer of the data, I guess.
Yeah. It's just such an exciting topic. I mean, one of the things that, as we think about futurist type things, to be grounded in the now, a lot of registry administration, I'm thinking about the American College of Surgeons. They run, well over 100 registries, large-scale registries. One of them I work with a lot, the Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery Accreditation and Quality Improvement Program. But the reality behind the scenes is that we're still dealing with pictures of pieces of paper and human beings manually abstracting, which is their fancy word for data entering, that data into some kind of research user interface. And there's all kinds of human error interpretation problems. And it's remarkable. We're talking about handwritten stuff, pictures of handwriting on digital pieces of paper flying around largely via fax, and then being routed to some human being who's opening the image and making judgment calls and interpreting handwriting in many cases and abstracting it into a registry database. And this is not one registry. This is many many registries due to the interop and data liquidity problems and security challenges that prevent, that prevent all that. If you could point an AI at large-scale OCR data or optical character recognition data, if you could point an AI at that at scale and have its accuracy be trustworthy, you would take a huge amount of inefficiency out of the labor force involved in mainstream current research administration. So I think you're really onto something in that area, and that's not even far-reaching AI potential. You know, that could be done now hypothetically.
Well, one of the cool things that a lot of people maybe haven't gotten there yet. If you're collecting data already, maybe it's something as simple as a fax. That's still digital data. There's no reason you have to reproduce what you're doing. Keep doing the inefficient system you're doing. Build the blockchain and let that just absorb the data as it's coming in. And maybe we don't have an AI that can handle that handwriting this year, but maybe in 3 years we have an AI that can read every doctor on our handwriting, and all that'll be in the blockchain. And then we can start doing studies about, how much human error really was there. Was it at 5 o'clock on Fridays when most of the mistakes were happening? You can start getting all kinds of cool information out.
Yeah.
And that blockchain would just sit there and just kind of, graze on this data that's coming through already, without reproducing or building a new system for it. So I think we've convinced a couple of people that they do want blockchains just based on the fact that we're telling them, don't throw away what you're doing. Let us add this on top, and then maybe it'll be incredibly useful in a year, and you're gonna, you won't know how you lived without
it. So it's super interesting. I'm going to launch this poll and let it run for a moment while we're talking about what I think is going to be one of my last questions for you guys. I am really, we've sort of had an orientation during this conversation about prospective research, about the activities involved in standing up a new study, recruiting investigators, moving forward with the administration of research. I wonder, with Science Distributed's vision, do you see an opportunity to unlock the oceans of data, that literally the oceans and oceans of data that has been, that was gathered originally prospectively under an IRB and is essentially locked away, not being shared, just like toothbrushes aren't being shared. I think that was such a funny quote. So I guess so while the audience is answering, we're at 74% of you have voted already, so thank you for that. While we're letting this poll run, Dr. Mannion, how do you see Science Distributed making strides in unlocking and activating the oceans of research past from a retrospective perspective? What are your thoughts on that? And then, John, I'd love to hear yours as well.
I have the advantage of having seen that take place for decades worth of data that had been collected at my previous place. We weren't sure what data was worthwhile and what wasn't, and so we brought together some of our experts, and we brought together the regulatory people, and we looked at the data sets from a broad perspective about what data elements were in there, what quality was there, what work would need to be done, what the cost would be, what the trade-offs would be, and then what the regulatory hoops would be to get that data analyzed. And we bucketed into, we definitely want to take this data and move it into some sort of a retrospective look. Other stuff was doable, but it would take a lot of effort, and we may not really want to do that given the limited resources. And then the third was, this is not stuff that's usable or salvageable in any reasonable way. We should be putting our resources towards something else. By being able to bucket those things, I think that we made that job a lot easier. I think that could be done across a lot of data sets that exist right now, but I would want to start with the actual existent publicly available ones. I think, in that self-generating team kind of way that you described, there's a lot of funding opportunities for groups to take retrospective looks at, Army STARS data, which is a psychological health study that was done at Uniformed Services University and now sits available with appropriate permissions at University of Michigan. you could get a group coming across our platform and putting in for funding so that they're able to look at this data, even if there's not a centralized unit that wants to do it. There's a group of people. So that self-assembly allows people to start looking at these data sets. And I think if you start to see that generated, you can work then with the people who own the data, be it government agencies or universities or even individual researchers, and say, hey, we have people who can help you dive into this data. All we need to do is put you in touch with them, and there's a way that we can make this data usable in a distributed, permissioned way that's going to be a lot safer. We can help you engage the regulatory people if that's a concern. And by making the platform allowing for that self-generated team to occur, engaging the people who own the data, I think you can have that down the line. I don't know that it's something we want to do in a cost-effective way early on. For the same reason I broke down the 3 different sets of data that we looked at DivBIC. I think those data sets that are publicly available are where you start. But once you have the system down, once you have the self-assembled team, that's where you can move into some of those other lost data sets and get value out of past monies spent and to be honest, past contributions by researchers and patients that may have gone untapped before this.
Yeah, that getting, even though it would be many steps to get there, getting to that point and giving research institutions and other collaborators who are sitting on huge mountains of data an opportunity to monetize that and contribute to the science, that it could just be huge. John, what do you think about that?
I mean, I agree with Sean, and there's definitely some of that data that maybe you should have an asterisk next to it and we don't want to necessarily use. But I think what these giant data sets really will do for us is they help us better understand what data is being collected, how is it being collected, and what does it look like. Is this test always collected this way because that's what the IRB insists, or is that just how the nurses are trained to get this information, or is that a function of you put it into Epic and so there's only 2 decimal places and so that's the data that gets spit out? So I think these big data sets, even if initially we wouldn't have the funding or the resources to blockchain all the things, I think they're really going to help us unlock what the data looks like and what the data that people want. If they want 40 years of it sitting on their desk, which ones did they end up using? What didn't they end up using? What's important? What turned out to be not so important? I think that's one of the big wins from these big data sets that hopefully we're going to be looking at soon.
Yeah, that makes all the sense. So here's our poll results. I am super excited to see that 13% of our audience is involved in research, has a broad understanding of the attributes that were discussed, and feels they're blockchain ready. So before you react to that, and I'm super interested to hear your reactions, I'm gonna you can see the way that these shake out. I just want to remind the audience that now's the time to get your questions entered into the dialogue box, and we're going to start the Q&A session in a moment here when we get on the other side of this initial reaction. So what do those poll responses surprise you, Dr. Mannion, and then John?
I'm happy to see 13% are blockchain ready, and please get in touch. We would love to work with you. I am not surprised that more people who are involved in research are not familiar with all of that information compared to those that are. It's been my experience, especially in complex data collection and in complex studies, that everyone has their own role, and only a few people, or maybe nobody at all, has, well, the PI, but not a lot of individuals have a broad perspective on all of those things. And so when getting a blockchain together, when talking about that network, you really want to get a team together. One of the things that concerns me is you see people, I mentioned before, developing a blockchain and then trying to push it for research or for healthcare. Very well meaning, but I don't think it's going to work that well for those individuals who are out there doing research. Similarly, even if you're engaging just one SME or one person on one study, they're probably not going to give you this perspective you need. It's really, and I mentioned John's sort of boutique architecture design firm for blockchain. These are not off the shelf. These are customizable things. It might have to be customizable for each study. It might have to be customizable depending upon the types of partners you have. It really takes some teamwork and some development in getting those people who know all of those things, or at least representatives of those types of things, together to get everything right. I mean, we did studies in cognitive rehabilitation that, I wouldn't try and do a blockchain for that data unless I had not just a PI, but a representative occupational therapist, a representative physical therapist, a representative speech language pathologist, because their data sets are all going to be different. And if you only have one of them, you might only build a blockchain that's good for your your physical therapy data. And that's where you need to really do a lot of, you measure twice and you cut once. You need to do a lot of work ahead of time, and that's what that poll data is not surprising to me based on that.
Okay, sounds good. It's interesting. John, what do you think about the poll data?
I think it's great that we have that many people that are blockchain aware. We didn't even have to gloss over this isn't a Bitcoin thing. Like, that's great. This is one of the first audience we've talked to with that high level of education about this stuff. So, it's cool.
That's fantastic. All right, well, we have our first questioner, and I'm going to give you a heads up, Marie. So Marie asked an interesting question about reproducibility and the fact that she asked, aren't we also kind of reproducing the same work in the blockchain space? And I think that's worth a little bit of discussion. Marie, I'm going to take you off of mute. 3, 2, 1. Hey there, Marie, are you there?
Hi, I'm here.
Hi there. Would you please elaborate on your question? I think it was a very insightful observation.
So this question came up for me when we were talking about reproducing a lot of the data sets over and over and over again, especially in this biomedical space. And it just seems to me, the more I learn about blockchain, the more I see a lot of the same types of blockchain solutions being created over and over and over again but it's just for this piece of data or that piece of data. And especially in this space where the data is so large, where you have images or big things to store, and the blockchain's being kind of layered on top of that as an access point. I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are about how much we're really going to have to reproduce these solutions, because that seems to be happening right now, versus having a more generalized solution that can go in and get a very diverse set of data and just pull it when it needs to. Comments?
Dr. Mannion, would you like to react to that first?
I think it is a very valid point. You don't want to bring a technology or process in that makes things more complicated. I've learned that within the federal government, and from a regulatory perspective, if you layer something new, be it a process or a technology, over an old one, and don't take into account what's already there and appropriately match it up or sundown something, you're just adding problems. And I think that consideration will rule some things out. I mean, I will quote Samson Williams here, and I will say, blockchain is not hot sauce. You can't just put that stuff on everything. And that applies wherever you are, and that applies in some cases with research data. The size problem is definitely something that you get with genetic data and with imaging. The side chain, or the putting the access itself on the blockchain with some centralized repository, a cloud, or a central server for the bigger files, is a solution for some people. But it may not be, especially at a single site study. I think really at the multi-site level is where I see the most applicability for this. But yeah, you want to make sure that you're not making things more complicated. I think that's a very valid point to make.
Thank you.
John, reaction to Marie's question?
I think Sean did a good job of explaining using the blockchain as a gatekeeper is a way of thinking of it. And you're like, yeah, but I log into my computer, and then I log into whatever software allows me to access those files currently. Why isn't that strong enough? And maybe it is, or maybe for whatever reason we want to have that as more of a decentralized way to access this thing, so there's not one point of failure, which is that university server that maybe it could be attacked, and you have that malware that's wipes the whole server if they don't pay a ransom. So maybe this is a way, And again, blockchain isn't the solution for all things, just like Sean said, but maybe this would be a way for especially very sensitive data to not have that central point of failure. And that was a reason for the original blockchain for Bitcoin. Like that was one of the first arguing and the first ideas for, well, let's build it this way so that we don't have this central point of failure or this central point of weakness.
Marie, so as you're thinking about your question of different participants in the blockchain ecosystem deploying tools and blockchains and potentially tokens that meet very similar requirements, I think it's an important observation, and we're seeing this incredible diaspora and expansion in this offering, and there's going to be an inevitable retraction and consolidation that comes. I don't know how many of us have effective predictors for the time frame for that, but it's certainly true that it doesn't necessarily help all of the possibilities for advancing civil liberties, human research protections, all kinds of wonderful things if there's so much competition early on. But that's just a little bit of my thought. Any further reaction or elaboration on your question before we put you back on mute?
No, we can move on. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Putting you back on mute. All right. Our next questioner is Manal. And Manal, so I'm giving you a heads up, going to be taking you off of mute. Manal's paid you some lovely compliments that I'll ask them to repeat, so you get to hear them firsthand, Dr. Mannion and John. But in addition to that, there's an interest in how potentially Science Distributed could participate or enable clinical research in remote areas with rural or vulnerable communities in a global health construct. I think that's a really interesting focus area, and I'm going to take you off of mute, Manal, in 3, 2, 1. Can you hear us, Manal? Or can we hear you, rather?
Do you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. So I would love it if you would pay the compliments that you were so kind to write out verbally. I'm sure they'd be well received, and then maybe elaborate on your question a little bit.
I just wanted to thank you very much for the presentation and for the awesome, innovative work that you are doing. I'm sure it's pioneering, and for simplifying all of that, blockchain health applications that you have shared. And as Heather pointed, I just had a question about how blockchain could either improve or assist in facilitating clinical research in remote areas and rural areas where there is poor resources or budgets, and also in global health. According to what you guys said, it seems like centralization of data and reproducibility of science could help these professionals who are in these areas. But I wonder if you guys, knowing the technicalities of blockchain more than I do, what frontiers are there for those who are interested in clinical research as it applies to health disparities and capacity building and all of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manal. John, how about you react to that one first? Then we'll go to Dr. Mannion.
Well, thanks for the compliments. We appreciate it. So one of the really cool things that we can do with blockchain, if you're running what's called a full node, you have a full set of that data. And then depending on your access level, maybe you can see all of it, maybe you can see some of it. That's great. One of the things you can do, though, is you can just broadcast data to the blockchain. So instead of having to run this, gigabyte after gigabyte, very heavy program, that maybe we don't have the electricity or the computing resources, all we have to do is get a signal out to dump data onto the blockchain, and then that data can be read anywhere in the world by an expert that has access. So obviously the permissions would all have to be there. Right now there's actually a project to try to get Bitcoin to places in the world without real internet access. And so they're broadcasting via satellite the Bitcoin blockchain. And it's not up all 24/7, but it's whenever it passes over that area, they're able to catch up any of the machines that are speaking back and forth to the satellite and running the blockchain. So it would be very easy, not to have a 24/7 connection if that's too expensive or just impossible, but it would be very easy to broadcast a signal whenever you can, catch the blockchain up, and then the experts, wherever in the world they may be, that are working with that group or working on that problem, they would have access to that data a couple minutes later. So I think this has huge applications. We're not going to have to write things on paper anymore. We're not going to have to carry flash drives and get it on a plane. We can literally just shoot it into space.
Wonderful.
Dr.
Mannion?
I appreciate your words and your kind words and the question. I think John covered really the strong value of this with getting clinical research out to broader places and broader populations. I know in the Defense Department, both the Center for Health Disparities at Uniform Services that I've worked with, and at Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, the usually underserved military population, which is the Guard and Reserves, oftentimes from rural areas, get missed a lot in the clinical research, and the solution to that is making research faster, easier, and more reliable if you disperse some of the nodes out there. And John described how that's done, and I think that's a great perspective on how this can do more for those underserved populations. I think another thing to stress is when we talk about human research protections, we talk about the privacy. Blockchain is actually in many ways a stronger way of sharing data in an encrypted fashion. I think that once the regulatory body and communities understand the value of that, it's going to allow us to get more dispersed research, I'll call it, not just multi-site studies, but absolutely multi-node studies across much broader places, across places that may not be served by a major hospital or major research center. And that will allow a lot more people whose personal data didn't get into studies before to be considered. It'll allow you to increase the N of any study and have very deep dives into sort of practice-based evidence looks of what subpopulations might be impacted in different ways than what we've already learned through standard research as it's done. So I think that's a great area to look into to find new uses of blockchain for research.
I think that's amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Mannion and John, for your insights. And I just had one more follow-up question. I wonder if you guys do conduct information sessions for those of us who are interested in knowing how blockchain could help us, either in health. I guess you guys focus on research. So in research practice.
I think this forum Heather has graciously invited us into is fantastic, and we've just started bringing the community of interest together in Baltimore. Heather is covering the DC population, but a webinar like this allows anybody to join. So we hope to continue partnering with Heather, and we have some thoughts on education events, be it blockchain 101 for people who still want to know more, but healthcare 101 for blockchain savvy people who might not understand healthcare data, and then talking about how those things could work in different forums. So we're hoping in 2018 we're going to be able to do a lot more. Hopefully Heather will have us back and we can work with her, because we think that she's got a great technological set of tools here, but also a wonderful knowledge base for applying blockchain to healthcare. So I think us partnering with her is the way we're going to do that.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Heather, for facilitating this.
You're very welcome, Manal, and just and John, John's organization with Blockchain Blueprint is another resource that's available for structured, facilitated exploration of applying different kinds of distributed ledger technology. And then one last thing I would leave you with is that from a global health perspective, disease surveillance is a very challenging priority, particularly in rural communities, and that is a key pilot area that the U.S. federal government has undertaken regarding influenza surveillance that has a lot of ability to scale and expand across communicable diseases. Then there's a range of other scenarios from maternal health to non-communicable disease prevention and treatment and related surveillance and translation, where the beneficiaries of foreign aid can be better activated and engaged using technologies that are enabled or facilitated by blockchain technology. So there's so much in that global health sphere. And there's also a couple of contacts that I think some of us might have who've really focused deeply in the global health application space. And if you'd like to reach out, happy to make some introductions. It sounds like you're really passionate about that. So thank you as well.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was really valuable. Yes, I will definitely reach out. And I'm a clinician and researcher at the same time and a public health professional. So that's why I have that kind of view and questions that are spreaded, on all of these intersections. But thank you guys.
That was wonderful questions. Thank you. Putting you back on mute. All right, so we have a whole bunch more questions than we have time to answer. I think we should take one more, and this is tough because I have to scan and pick one. So I think let's go with Jim. So we have Jim Nasser, and I'm going to take you off of mute in 3, 2, 1. Talking about the roles of digital IDs. Jim,
hey,
are you there? Hi there. Would you like to elaborate on your question regarding digital IDs in clinical research?
Sure, yes. Hi, Heather. Sean, great job. John as well. It's great to see you guys make this kind of progress. So my question really is where do you see for use cases digital ID working out? How do you see it playing out? There's all kinds of ideas around this. I don't think there is any real consensus, at least here in the US yet. So I'm interested in where you guys see it, and also if you see it as a catalyst for some of the things that you guys are thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mannion, would you like to take that one first?
Sure. Great to hear from you, Jim. I almost invoked you in that last answer because you are leading the way in many ways with this. I think from a science distributed perspective, I don't know how heavily we're going to get involved in that aspect, but I know it's of keen importance to a lot of researchers, and so it may come in a way I'm not identifying. I think the identification is something on a lot of people's minds because of the challenge with refugees, the challenge with people moving from one place to another. So all of a sudden, I do start to see the value in having a stance on that for blockchain for research. If people are moving about from one place to another, how are you identifying these individuals? Even going over to Europe with the upcoming GDPR. That's coming in May, and the right to be forgotten, and some of the new challenges there. Identification of individuals across studies, identification of individuals persisting in data where they have the right legally to be forgotten is two separate challenges. I had a brief exchange on this subject with some people recently, and I wonder if there isn't a way of using the general use ID combined with blockchain and AI to have, as far as I know, AI can look at identifiable data even if the law says that humans can't anymore or says that they can't in a certain situation. So from a human research protections perspective, AI may allow for sort of a dual layered blockchain that if, under GDPR, I'm still getting it right. And the right to be forgotten, maybe you can scrub that person's data, that identification from the top layer that humans have access to, but via a general use ID linkage and in a secondary blockchain, have AI be able to pull that data out in a de-identified way. Maybe not what you were getting towards with identification in that instance, but because I had that recent dialogue, that does come to mind. I think it's something that needs to continue to be tackled, continue to be considered, both for research and beyond. Obviously, it's something within healthcare and within, you know, remote or poorly served populations, or populations that are forced out of where they have had, you know, better health care, that it needs to be considered. But I don't have all the answers, but I think more dialogue on that subject is definitely warranted. So thanks for bringing it up.
John, would you like to react to that question?
Sure. I mean, I think that's, if we're going to be having conversations with universities, this is going to be one of the things that they're going to ask us about. Even if it's not something that we're going to be doing, it's we're opening the door to these kind of conversations. So I feel like that's something that's going to come up. Personally, just based on my reading and my research, I think biometrics are kind of have to be the way that we go in the future. I mean, you can't expect people to remember a 56-digit alphanumeric string of gibberish, especially if they're in the back of an ambulance going to the hospital. So, and maybe that's the original way you get in. And if it's just a normal visit, I have my card with my number on it. But in the case of an emergency, being able to unlock that medical record with a fingerprint, or, I mean, Apple can do the face scans now, so we're getting there, you know.
They work like 30 or 40% of the time, I find. Sorry, couldn't resist.
Well, hey, yeah. It's new technology, right?
Yes, absolutely. So a couple of quick reactions on that. I think that in our discussion of private permissioned research networks versus public blockchains, I think there's a lot of interesting discourse to be had about perhaps identity management is the one tier that always makes sense for a public blockchain if we can maintain multiple contexts of identity, and the role of the federal government in establishing perhaps one dimension of that identity. Not to turn the question back around on you, Jim, but I know most of the people on the line wouldn't know your particular role. Do you mind just quickly introducing yourself and then maybe sharing a touch about your perspective on it?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I appreciate that. Yes, so I'm the chief software architect over at the division of the Center for Surveillance Epidemiology and Laboratory Services at the CDC. Effectively, the division that is focused on building applications that are science-based and citizen-facing. You know, my perspective on this, you know, is actually not particularly popular, I guess, in the mix, but I think that the federal government, you know, does have a role in providing, not providing the actual digital identity for citizens, but providing the oversight perhaps for a set of foundations or whatever to administer that. I don't think people like Civic or Sovereign independently, you know, can do that without assistance or some kind of oversight, just like the SEC does for equities. So that's my personal opinion for what it's worth. However, I do believe, and I think you guys addressed this partially a little bit earlier, that the idea of kind of chain compatibilities and being able to go across different ledgers is really important. And you know, that's where we've seen some innovation around you know, side chains and second layer solutions and things like that. I think, again, digital identity needs to work across, you know, across multiple options. And you guys are probably familiar with you know, Ethereum, that there's now a new kind of Ethereum request for comment 725 that basically kind of alludes to a digital identity across all Ethereum implementations, which is definitely a step forward. So all to say, but you know, going back to your kind of question, Heather, I think that the federal government does have a role to play, and we've seen that successfully in places like Estonia and Switzerland, and places like that. You know, it just has to be tempered versus, you know, the level of, I guess, federal control versus oversight.
Very, very interesting, you know, where the role to play in governance, but potentially through an arm's length relationship granted to a nonprofit, something that allows greater degrees of freedom in the liberty sense, the classic liberty sense. That's definitely interesting. Dr. Mannion or John, any last reactions to Jim's statements?
Not anything specific, other than it's definitely an area I have not spent as much time considering because I didn't see it as directly applicable. But thinking about it even just right now, I think it's gonna bleed into the conversation of any research usage, especially when you get into the regulatory aspect. So I'm gonna start paying more attention. So thank you, Jim.
John?
I agree with Jim. I mean, right now we have several federal numbers that are identifying us, right? We have our social security, we have a passport number, maybe we have a driver's license number issued by the state, and there are all these separate systems that don't tend to communicate, that are all identifying us, that can all be leaked if our credit gets hacked, you know. So we're already there, we're already in that system, but we're in version 1.0 of that system that was built 80 years ago. So I'd love to see an upgrade, and I think it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and think what could be done with the patient matching problem in research. I mean, that's an enormous opportunity for advancement. Well, Jim, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and put you back on mute. Really appreciate your question. All right. And with that, we are over time. Thank you for a patient and highly engaged audience. While we are making closing remarks, here's our last poll question. This is something we've actually gotten a lot of questions about, people wanting to engage and asking in more detail about how to engage. If you are interested, this will give us an official organized way to filter that back to the folks from Science Distributed. So any closing remarks? We'll start with you, John, and then go to you, Dr. Mannion. Closing remarks for this evening?
I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. I hope you got some good ideas from us, from what we're looking to do, and hopefully we're going to hear from you guys too. This is really what we're doing now, is we're starting the discussion, and I think that by having this discussion, great things are coming down the road for everybody. I mean, as Sean keeps saying, you know, faster miracles. So that's the goal, and thanks.
Thank you, John. And Dr. Mannion.
And I agree with John. Thank you all for your attention and staying with us. I think we've been having a number of great dialogues throughout the blockchain and healthcare community, and looking a little more directly at research. I'm excited to see what it can bring to Science Distributed. We're going to have the full launch in January, and there's a lot more aspects than just the blockchain, but I think it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of dialogue to make any functional blockchain for research. So we want to be in contact with anyone who's interested, and please reach out to us if you are. And Heather, I want to thank you for setting up this forum. This has been great, and I love that you're able to take what has been sort of a local community of interest and expand it more broadly to anyone who might want to join in live, or hopefully we can distribute some of the recorded follow up. Thank you.
Absolutely, you're very welcome. It's been an honor to have you both. Incredibly excited about your vision for Science Distributed, and it's a tremendous part to be part of your soft launch. Very, very exciting. Notice we have that 13% who is interested in serving as an organizational node within Science Distributed's research network, and another 20% interested in participating as individual nodes. So that is incredibly exciting. And in closing, I'd just like to remind all of you that the broader the dissemination of the registration link for this event, the more exposure we can gain. We're going to keep this free. It's not something we're monetizing, and we appreciate any of you who feel that the event is of a high quality to please share the registration link. And this event is sponsored by my organization, Obesity Prevention Policy and Management. It's an honor to be with all of you this evening, and our next event is Wednesday, January 3rd. And I know you'll be very pleased with the speaker announcement. I hope everyone has very happy holidays, and good night.